I opened Amy's laptop because I was trying to be useful. It was a Tuesday night, the kind where the house feels slightly too quiet. Dishwasher humming, the kids' backpacks dumped by the entryway, my printer light blinking like it always did when it was low on ink. I had promised the boys I'd have the baseball tickets printed and ready, the nice paper ones they liked to hold in their hands like they were something real. Amy's laptop was already on the kitchen table. Lit up, screen awake. I didn't think twice. We shared everything that mattered. Bills, calendars, school emails, grocery lists. I clicked into her email, then realized her messages were open in another window. Not email, texts, some desktop apps synced to her phone. The conversation was already sitting there, like someone had left a door unlocked by accident. I wasn't searching. I wasn't even curious. I was just there. The last line was at the bottom, clean and bright on the screen. Last night was worth it. A heart emoji. I stared at it long enough that my eyes started to feel dry, like my brain was waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something harmless. The sender's name was Derek. I scrolled up once, twice. My finger barely moved on the trackpad because I didn't trust my hand. The date stamped beside the messages matched the same day Amy told me she'd flown to Houston for corporate training. The day she'd kissed the kids goodbye in the driveway and told me not to wait up because the schedule would run late. I felt the air leave my chest, but my body stayed strangely steady. No dramatic rush, no noise, just a quiet, heavy click in my head, like a lock turning. In that moment, I understood something simple and irreversible. The life I thought I knew had just cracked, and I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a sheet of ticket paper, realizing I didn't know who my wife was when she wasn't here. Before that night, our life was the kind people described as solid. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Phoenix where the streets curved in slow loops and the same dogs barked at the same joggers every morning. Our house wasn't big, but it had the things we'd worked for: 2 paid-off cars in the driveway, a backyard the kids could run in, and a mortgage that felt manageable as long as nothing went wrong. We had 2 kids, both in elementary school, both loud in the way children are when they still assume the world is safe. Saturdays were hardware store errands, soccer fields, and whatever grilling plan I convinced myself was relaxing. Sundays were chores and trying to get ahead of the week. We knew our neighbors just enough to wave, just enough to borrow a ladder, just enough to pretend we were all doing fine. I worked as a financial analyst. Most days I was in an office staring at spreadsheets and forecasts, watching numbers behave the way people rarely did. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I liked steady. I liked knowing what to expect and what a decision would cost 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. I built my whole adult life on that habit. Measure, plan, adjust. Amy coordinated events for a nonprofit. When we met, I loved how she could walk into a room and make people feel included without trying too hard. She remembered names. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Even after we had kids, she kept that energy, like she had a small extra battery other people didn't. Then her job shifted. New director, new goals, more donors to impress, more engagement. She started talking about networking the way people talk about weather, something you couldn't control, only prepare for. She stayed late more often. She came home with her hair still fixed, makeup still neat, like she hadn't spent the day running around. She bought new clothes that weren't for the office, exactly, but weren't for home either. And she started going to the gym at times that didn't match our old routine. I noticed all of it. I also did what I always did with things I didn't want to understand. I explained them into something simpler. She's building her career. She's under pressure. She's just trying to feel confident again. I told myself that marriage was a long project, and sometimes you let your partner expand without making it about you. Looking back, I can see how badly I wanted stability to be true. I wanted the story we told ourselves to keep working: good parents, decent jobs, normal problems. It was easier to believe that than to admit there might be another story running underneath, one I wasn't hearing. So I stayed quiet. I kept packing lunches. I kept paying bills. I kept assuming that if you showed up, if you stayed consistent, life stayed consistent back. Until the laptop screen proved it didn't. I didn't stop at the last message. Once you see one fracture, you check the foundation. That's how I've always operated. So I scrolled up and read the entire thread, slowly, the way I'd read a contract before signing it. It started harmless enough. A charity-run planning committee. A joke about early mornings. Coffee after meetings because no one else gets here on time anyway. The tone shifted gradually, like a dial turning one notch at a time. Compliments disguised as encouragement. You're the only one who actually understands the pressure. You deserve more than what you settle for. I paused at that line. You deserve more. I tried to remember the last time I told her that. Not on a birthday card or on an anniversary, but on a random Tuesday when nothing special was happening. I couldn't. The messages tightened after that. Less about the nonprofit. More about how she felt. How tired she was. How unseen. He responded like he'd been waiting for the opening. Short sentences. Confident. Certain. Then Houston. He asked what hotel she was staying at. She sent the name. He replied with a room number hours later. No confusion. No hesitation. Just logistics. I kept reading, even when I already knew. The next morning he wrote, "Last night was worth it." And she answered with a heart. There was no panic in the messages that followed. No regret. They discussed flights home. A donor meeting. Whether anyone had noticed they'd left the conference early. It was structured. Planned. Calm. My stomach tightened, but my thoughts stayed clear. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't misreading tone. This wasn't emotional overthinking. It was written in plain language between two adults who knew exactly what they were doing. Later in the thread, weeks after Houston, she wrote something that stopped me more than the hotel ever could. I just had to do it once. I needed to know. He doesn't have to find out. I read that line 3 times. I wasn't supposed to know. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. That was the plan. Not a mistake. Not a lapse. A contained experiment. A decision she believed she could execute without consequence. At first it sounded absurd, like something someone says when they've lost perspective. But the longer I stared at it, the more everything aligned too cleanly to ignore. The late nights. The extra care with her phone. The sudden trainings. The gym sessions at odd hours. It wasn't chaos. It was coordination. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the quiet assumption behind it, that I would remain stable, predictable, unaware. That my role was to continue being the dependable background while she tested the edges of her life. I closed the laptop gently, not out of respect for her, but because I didn't want the kids hearing anything unusual in my voice. The evidence wasn't emotional. It was chronological, and it was enough. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't pace the kitchen or rehearse speeches in my head. I didn't wake her up and demand a confession. I finished printing the tickets. I set them on the counter. I checked the boys' homework and signed a permission slip that had been sitting in a folder by the fridge. When Amy came home, she kissed my cheek the same way she always did, quick, automatic, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I watched her longer than usual. The way she set her purse down. The way she asked about dinner. There was no visible crack in her behavior. If anything, she seemed relaxed. I answered normally. I kept my voice even. Years in finance had trained me to separate reaction from action. Markets swing. You don't. You gather information first. Something inside me shifted that night, but it wasn't explosive. It was structural. A quiet recalibration. I stopped trying to interpret her tone for reassurance. I stopped filling in emotional blanks with generous assumptions. I stopped protecting her from questions I hadn't asked. Instead, I started protecting myself from illusions. For days, I said very little beyond what was necessary. Not cold, not distant, just precise. When she mentioned work, I nodded. When she said she might have another training trip in the fall, I said, okay. I didn't ask for details. I didn't volunteer interest. The need to understand her motives faded faster than I expected. Whether she felt neglected, whether she was bored, whether Derek had said the right words at the right time. None of that changed the fact that she had made a choice and then built a plan around keeping me uninformed. That was the piece I couldn't soften. At night, when the house was quiet, I replayed her line in my head. I just had to do it once. As if betrayal were a checkbox. As if marriage were elastic enough to stretch around a secret and snap back into place without damage. As if my ignorance had been part of the design. The anger I expected never really arrived. What replaced it was clarity. The kind that makes small talk feel unnecessary. The kind that makes you realize you've been standing on something that looked solid but wasn't reinforced the way you thought. I began thinking in practical terms. What did we own jointly? How were accounts structured? What would custody look like if things fractured? I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about outcomes. I was assessing exposure. She made a decision in Houston. Now I would make mine, but I would do it carefully, deliberately, without spectacle. I didn't slam doors because slammed doors close options. I didn't yell because raised voices distort facts. I simply stopped asking questions that assumed we were still moving in the same direction. And in that quiet space, I started preparing for the possibility that we weren't. Once I stopped reacting, I started observing. It's a different posture entirely. Reaction is loud, even when you keep it inside. Observation is quiet. It waits. I paid attention to patterns the way I would if I were auditing a set of accounts. Not because I wanted to catch her in something new, but because I needed to understand the scope of what already existed. Amy began guarding her phone in subtle ways. Nothing dramatic, no sudden passwords or obvious panic, just small adjustments. She started flipping it face down on the table. She took it with her when she walked to the laundry room. When a notification lit up the screen, her eyes moved first, then her hand. One evening, while we were watching television, her phone buzzed twice in quick succession. She didn't reach for it immediately. She waited a few seconds too long, like she was trying to appear casual. Then she picked it up and smiled at something she didn't share. "Work stuff?" she said before I asked. I hadn't asked. The lies weren't aggressive. They were preemptive. I kept a mental record of dates. When she mentioned an evening donor meeting, I marked it on the calendar in my office. When she said she'd be home late, I checked the time she actually walked through the door. I didn't accuse. I didn't hint. I just documented. Then I pulled our credit card statements. We had always used a joint account for travel expenses, reimbursed later by her nonprofit. It was practical, transparent. That's what I used to call it. The Houston hotel charge was there. 2 nights. Same dates she'd told me about. But there was an additional charge, a dinner at a restaurant inside the hotel, late, past 9:30. She had told me she grabbed room service and went to bed early because the training sessions were long. The numbers didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. They simply existed. I downloaded 3 months of statements. There were smaller transactions I'd overlooked before. Parking garages on nights she claimed to be at local events within walking distance. A boutique hotel downtown charged for conference space that didn't match any event she had mentioned. None of it screamed betrayal by itself. Together, it formed a line. What struck me most wasn't the money. It was the use of shared resources. Our account. The same account that paid for school supplies and pediatrician visits. The same account we reviewed together at the end of each month. It wasn't just emotional dishonesty. It was structural. I began separating what I could quietly. I opened an individual savings account and redirected a portion of my paycheck. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to establish independence if I needed it. I copied important documents, tax returns, mortgage statements, insurance policies, and stored them in a secure folder. I wasn't planning a confrontation yet. I was preparing for clarity. At dinner, I listened more than I spoke. Amy talked about upcoming events, about Derek occasionally, always in passing. He's coordinating the vendor contracts. He's good with sponsors. She never looked at me when she said his name. The facts kept stacking up, quietly, without emotion. And the more I observed, the less doubt I felt. The message from Sarah came on a Thursday afternoon while I was at my desk. It landed in my inbox with a subject line that was almost polite. "We need to compare notes." No accusation. No drama. Just a sentence that suggested she already knew enough. I recognized the last name immediately. Derek's. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Not out of fear, but because responding would make everything more concrete. Up until then, the betrayal existed inside my house, inside my own quiet documentation. Answering her meant acknowledging that this wasn't contained. It had radius. I replied with a single line. When and where? We met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral ground. Late morning, when most people were at work. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table against the wall where I could see the door. Sarah walked in exactly on time. She looked composed in the way people do when they've run out of energy for shock. No visible anger. No theatrics. Just fatigue and focus. We didn't waste time pretending this was casual. "I found messages," she said, sitting down across from me. "So did I answered. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots. The tone was familiar. Encouragement layered with flirtation, small complaints about home life framed as harmless venting. The same phrases I had read on Amy's laptop. The same hotel. The same dates. Houston wasn't an isolated incident. There had been other meetings. A conference in San Diego that neither organization officially hosted. A weekend planning retreat that appeared on both of their calendars, but nowhere else. We compared timelines like accountants reconciling discrepancies. No raised voices. No blaming each other. Just two people mapping the same lie from opposite sides. "What do you plan to do?" she asked. "I'm still deciding," I said, which was true. Preparation isn't the same as execution. She nodded. "I have kids too." That was the sentence that shifted the room. It wasn't about revenge or exposure. It was about damage control. About minimizing fallout for people who didn't ask to be part of this. Before we left, we agreed on one thing. We would not coordinate some dramatic confrontation. No ambushes. No public scenes. Whatever decisions we made would be separate, handled in our own homes. As I walked back to my car, I felt something settle. The betrayal was no longer theoretical. It wasn't just patterns and statements. It had names, cross-references, corroboration. What began as private humiliation had expanded into two families connected by the same choice neither of us made. Driving home, I realized this wasn't about catching Amy anymore. It was about deciding what kind of life I was willing to continue living once the truth was fully acknowledged. I waited until the house was empty. My parents took the kids for the weekend under the excuse that they wanted extra time before school started again. Amy didn't question it. She seemed almost relieved for the break. That, more than anything, confirmed how separate our realities had become. Saturday evening, the house felt too orderly. No cartoons in the background. No arguments over which movie to watch. Just the low hum of the air conditioner and the sound of Amy moving around in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I know about Derek." I kept my voice even. Not sharp. Not wounded. Just factual. She froze for half a second, barely noticeable, but enough. Then she turned, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Know what?" she asked. There it was. The first layer. "I read the messages," I said. "Houston. The hotel." Silence stretched between us. Not explosive. Not chaotic. Just heavy. She tried to hold eye contact, but it slipped. "It's not what you think." I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I let her choose her version. "It was a mistake," she said finally. "It just happened." "It didn't just happen," I replied. "You planned it." That was when the tears came. Not dramatic sobbing. Controlled. Strategic, almost. She moved to the chair at the table and sat down like her legs had given out. "I had to do it once," she said, the same words I had already read. "I needed to know. It wasn't supposed to go anywhere. You weren't supposed to find out." The repetition was surreal. Hearing her say it aloud removed any remaining doubt that I had misinterpreted the messages. "You weren't supposed to know." She said it again, softer this time, like that was the real tragedy. I sat across from her and folded my hands on the table. I felt detached, like I was observing a negotiation rather than a marriage. "You made a decision," I said, "and you built a plan around keeping me uninformed." She shook her head. I was confused. I felt invisible. He just saw me. I didn't challenge that either. Whether she felt unseen didn't change the outcome. Feelings might explain a choice. They don't erase it. "I'm not asking for details," I told her. "I already know enough." That unsettled her more than anger would have. There was nothing to argue against. No emotional leverage to grab onto. "I don't want to lose our family," she said. "We can fix this." That was the moment I realized something had shifted permanently inside me. I wasn't weighing options the way I thought I would. I wasn't calculating whether reconciliation was possible. I was measuring trust, and the numbers didn't balance. "I don't think we're standing in the same place anymore," I said quietly. She reached across the table, but I didn't move. For the first time since I'd opened the laptop, I understood that saving everything at any cost wasn't strength. Sometimes strength is deciding not to pretend it didn't break. I filed 3 weeks later. Not the next day. Not in a rush. I used the time the way I use any major decision. Verify, prepare, execute. I met with an attorney during my lunch breaks and brought copies of everything I had organized. Statements, timelines, screenshots, account summaries. I didn't embellish. I didn't speculate. I laid out facts. He listened carefully and said something simple. "Infidelity matters emotionally. Legally, it depends." I understood that. Courts aren't built to process betrayal. They process assets, custody schedules, income differentials. When Amy was served, she didn't call me immediately. She texted first. Is this really happening? I replied, yes. That evening she confronted me in the living room, papers in her hand like they were something foreign. You're just giving up? She asked. No, I said. I'm responding. She shifted quickly from disbelief to negotiation. She wanted the house. She wanted stability for the kids. She wanted financial support that would allow her to land on her feet. The language changed. It became strategic. We mediated before stepping into a courtroom. Even then, the outcome didn't feel like justice or punishment. It felt procedural. Arizona law didn't weigh her choice the way I once assumed it might. Assets were divided. Parenting time was structured. Alimony was debated. In several areas, the court didn't favor me. I left the final hearing not angry, but aware. Marriage had been emotional. Divorce was administrative. Afterward, Amy began texting daily. I made a mistake. We can still fix this. Derek ended it. It didn't mean anything. That last one landed strangely. It didn't mean anything. As if meaning were the measurement that mattered most. Through Sarah, I learned Derek had returned home and committed to repairing his marriage. Whether that would hold, I didn't know. What I did know was that Amy's one time had not transformed into a new life. It had dissolved under pressure. She was left standing alone in the space she created. I didn't respond to most of her messages. Not out of cruelty. Out of finality. Every reply reopens negotiation. Silence closes it. Logistics replaced conversation. Exchange times. School schedules. Medical forms. We spoke about the children clearly and directly. Nothing more. There were moments she tried to drift back into familiarity. A comment about a memory. A joke about an old vacation. I didn't engage. Nostalgia can blur accountability. The house was sold. Equity split. Furniture divided with surprising efficiency. It was remarkable how quickly a shared life can be itemized. When I packed my office, I found the printed baseball tickets tucked inside a drawer. The edges were bent from being handled that night. I left them there. Events had unfolded without spectacle. No public collapse. No dramatic exposure. Just a series of choices, followed by consequences that didn't require my anger to exist. And for the first time since Houston, I felt something close to steady again. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from the old house. Close enough that the kids' routines didn't fracture. Same school district. Same soccer field. Same grocery store where the cashier knew their names. I wasn't trying to build a new life overnight. I was trying to keep the damage contained. The apartment was quiet in a different way than the house had been. Thinner walls. Different light through the windows. The first night I slept there alone, I noticed how sound travels when you're by yourself. The refrigerator cycling on. Footsteps in the hallway outside. The absence of another person's breathing in the dark. It didn't feel tragic. It felt clear. I set up the kids' room first. Bunk beds against the far wall. Their books lined up on a low shelf. I made sure their favorite blankets were already there before their first overnight stay. Stability isn't grand gestures. It's consistency. When they asked why I wasn't living at the house anymore, I kept it simple. Mom and I decided we'll live in different places, but we both love you. They accepted that more easily than adults would. Children adjust to structure if the structure stays predictable. Amy continued to text for weeks. I miss you. I've been thinking about everything. We were good together. I didn't argue those points. We had been good together in many ways. That was what made the fracture significant. But good history doesn't guarantee a stable future. There were nights I sat at the small kitchen table after the kids were asleep and replayed everything from the beginning. The laptop, the hotel charge, the meeting with Sarah, the conversation in our kitchen. I tested each memory for doubt, the way I would recheck a formula in a spreadsheet. The numbers still balanced. Her one time hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated risk based on the assumption that I would remain unaware or unwilling to act. That assumption turned out to be wrong. I didn't celebrate the divorce. There was no sense of victory in dividing assets or adjusting custody calendars. There was only acceptance. Some friends expected anger. Others expected visible heartbreak. I gave them neither. What I felt was something quieter, a return to alignment. My internal reality matched the external one again. No more pretending not to see inconsistencies. No more editing the narrative to preserve comfort. The apartment slowly began to feel less temporary. I bought a modest dining table instead of using folding chairs. I hung framed photos of the kids on the wall. I established routines that belonged solely to my household. Saturday morning pancakes, evening walks around the complex. I didn't need to prove resilience to anyone. Her decision cost us the structure we built. My decision ensured I didn't keep living inside something that no longer existed. That distinction mattered more than blame. And in that small, quiet apartment, I began to recognize something steady returning. Not happiness, not triumph, but stability. The kind that doesn't depend on someone else choosing correctly. Sometimes I think about that message. Not the hotel, not the courtroom, just that single line glowing on her screen. Last night was worth it. For a long time, I replayed it the way you replay a market crash in your head, wondering if there was a signal you missed, a warning you ignored. But clarity doesn't always announce itself in advance. Sometimes it arrives all at once, in plain text. It doesn't hurt anymore. What surprises me most is that the humiliation faded faster than the uncertainty did. Once the uncertainty was gone, once I stopped pretending not to see what was directly in front of me, the rest became manageable. I don't hate her. I don't wish her failure. I simply understand that we were operating on different definitions of commitment. Hers allowed for a private exception. Mine didn't. The boys are older now. They move easily between homes. Life has structure again, just configured differently. If I've learned anything, it's this. I wasn't the one who didn't know. And now, I'm not the one who looks away. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.